Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil?
What evil isn't an easy question to answer. It's one of the more difficult questions to answer, because how we answer that will affect what we think about it.
I would define evil as the deliberate infliction of psychological or physical pain or deprivation in a way that serves the interests of the perpetrator.
In the Christian view, evil is anything that is opposed to God.
Well, I think of evil as a corruption of what is good.
That the good is a social or communal phenomenon, and therefore evil is also, at least in part, a social or communal phenomenon.
In many ways, I would think that evil is a fairly personal matter. In some ways, people have a personal conviction of what is evil and what is perhaps good.
The problem of evil isn't a problem for everybody. It's a problem for people who believe in a certain type of deity, that is, an all-powerful, all-living God. For them, it's a challenge to their belief to explain how that being allows suffering. Predominantly, it's a problem, at least in the history of theology, for people who want to believe in a certain sort of God. People who we refer to as theists have the problem of evil as something that either they feel themselves is an issue or is raised by people who don't believe as a problem, or even, as we'll go on to see, a potential obstacle to their belief of the sort that they have. In order for us to understand the nature of the problem, we have to understand the nature of God, or what traditional religions have understood the nature of God to be. So it's not the problem of evil just comes from belief in God. Rather, it comes from belief in a certain sort of God. That's to say, a God which has certain specific attributes. The kind of God that's involved in the problem of evil is one who has certainly two key features. One of these is omnipotence. The other attribute of God, sometimes rather grandly called omnibenevolence. Omnibenevolence is the idea of being all-loving. Not all gods have always been seen as all-loving. Historically, many gods have been quite unpleasant, and religion's been about persuading them not to do unpleasant things to us, our family, or our crops. And omnipotence is understood usually as meaning all-powerful, and seems very simple. All-powerful, can do anything, but immediately that should make us think it's not simple. It's complicated, it's awkward, and it's potentially riddled with paradoxes. Because does meaning you can do anything mean you can do things that aren't possible? So if we believe in that kind of God, and we believe there is evil in the world, then we have a problem, and we'll go out to lay this problem out in more detail in a moment. But before we get there, we should perhaps pause and reflect for a moment on what is evil. Is evil a thing? That's perhaps the first question. Often the word evil is used both in popular usage in the newspapers and the tabloid press, but also in theology to refer to something substantive, solid. You know, evil feels like a very kind of full concept. So this is one understanding of evil. Evil, as it's understood in the problem of evil, as we're looking at it, is usually split. So there's normally a distinction made between two categories of evil. One of these is sometimes called moral evil, the other natural.
Moral evil refers to human acts, evil human acts. It therefore makes direct reference to the matter of the human will. So an act by a terrorist will be an example of moral evil. However, that's not the only sort of evil by which people are affected, and this other sort is said to be natural evil. It's the sort of evil that comes to us out of nature, so to speak.
Evil, for me, is a human phenomenon. It's not a natural one. The notion of natural evil makes very little sense to me. I think that natural disasters leave human suffering in their wake, but they don't have an intentional victim.
And people will reflect and think, how can an all-loving, all-powerful God allow awful, huge disasters on a massive scale to happen when supposedly the natural world is under, potentially, the command of God? There are a number of kind of minor problems that we might address with this. One is the term evil is so powerfully evocative that some people have suggested we might abandon it and talk about the problem of suffering. Ought we not to call it, what is the problem about how God allows human suffering? There are difficulties again with this definition. Very briefly explain them. One of them is, not all suffering is a bad thing.
Suffering is always, I think, a consequence of evil, as it were. It is always an evil thing. It is simply that some evil things can have good consequences.
Say, for example, as a Christian, if you look at things from a sort of theological or biblical theological framework, you can think that suffering is sometimes given by God, say, for instance, in the New Testament, and that would be in order to make people grow and develop in their lives and in their Christian faith.
Certainly, the infliction of pain can produce all sorts of solidarity and care for the suffering other. And we know that there were women in the death and concentration camps during the period of the Nazi Reich who responded to the suffering of others and their own suffering through looking after other people, trying to retain some human dignity in a dehumanizing situation.
Certain sorts of physical suffering to do with pain may well be of benefit to human beings. So when you feel pain on touching a hot plate, the pain is not in itself a good thing, but you react by taking your hand away from the hot plate. There's another sort of way in which human beings may benefit from suffering, but this is a very troubling matter. One example, for instance, would be the effect upon a child of the divorce of their parents. The child may come through that experience and feel more independent or more self-confident, say. So you might say, in that sense, the child benefits from the suffering. But what you then wouldn't go on to say is that the divorce was a good thing.
So perhaps we can revise our notion of the problem of suffering. We might call it the problem of undeserved suffering, of innocent suffering. That might be an alternative way to think about it. Perhaps we could not call it the problem of evil, but one of undeserved suffering. Well, this is potentially problematic again because it introduces a complicated value judgment about who deserves to suffer and who doesn't. We might take a certain reading of St. Augustine and certain ways of interpreting certain elements of Christian theology to say, well, in one way, from one perspective, we all deserve it. If we take rather a partial but possible reading of the doctrine of original sin, we might say there are no innocents.
The doctrine of original sin affirms that all human beings, by their nature as human beings, are somehow tainted. Augustine of Hippo, who is perhaps the leading Western theologian, promoted this idea, and therefore it has had a profound influence in the Christianity of the Latin West.
Well, certainly the effects of sin, as I said, not only to affect human life, but the whole of creation. I think not only Augustine, but most traditional Christian theologians up to the sort of 19th century would have held this sort of view.
The idea here is that as sin entered through the primal pair of Adam and Eve and their act of disobedience towards God, that human beings, as heirs to Adam and Eve, are also all caught up in this original sin.
It changes everything from the good creation, God saw that it was good, into one in which there is pain and hostility and hard labor. In other words, all the things that are the stuff of the life that we all observe.
And then, if some people seem to have more difficult lives than others, do we start to think, well, obviously, they're somehow morally inferior and they deserve it? So talking about undeserved suffering, or the problem of the suffering of the innocent, has its own difficulties, has its own potential drawbacks. Also, evil, while potentially bringing in a lot of other ideas, is a very powerful word, and it's the word that's been used within Christian tradition to understand this problem, to refer to this problem. St. Augustine, he's rather interesting in relation both to the problem of evil and also more generally in relation to sin. He seems to see that all suffering, all human suffering, in the view of St. Augustine, is either me sinning or the results of sin. If somebody appears to suffer without a human cause, it may well be we can explain it by referring to the general sin of humanity. The general sin. The general sin in terms of original sin, and the idea that it wasn't God who introduces sin into the world. And you get this often in an Augustinian reading of the problem of evil, this idea that if there is sin in the world, which leads to suffering, if sinning is seen as the base cause of suffering, it didn't come from God. It came from human frailty in the Garden of Eden.
Original sin suggests that sin has a beginning. It enters a good creation with Adam and Eve. So in a strange sort of way, it's a hopeful notion in the sense that if sin has a beginning, maybe it also has an end.
Sin is something that's been introduced into the world, and it needn't have been like this had it not been for certain kinds of human activity. So undeserved suffering is problematic. Evil has its own problems, but as we see, that's the way it's been understood in the church, in theology. And as we start to go through Augustine, we can see that evil links us into key concepts like sin.
So I think the main thing is just to try and find out what the actual word evil is, what you think when you first think of evil.
So do you then think that evil is different to suffering, or is it the same?
What is the difference then between natural evil and moral evil?